Good afternoon. I'm Carlin Bowman, and I'm a senior fellow here at AEI, and I'd like to welcome all of you and our C-SPAN audience to this session on making the 2020 census succeed. When Mike Strain asked if I would moderate today's event, I responded enthusiastically. I know that it is virtually impossible for many of my colleagues to do the important work that they do without the data the census provides. The same is true for policymakers and for the business community across the country. Any opportunity to talk about the value of our premier statistical agency is always worthwhile. There are additional reasons for having this panel discussion now. The dress rehearsal for the 2020 census is underway in Providence County, Rhode Island. This is the only place where the census is running a full test, as the census didn't have the funds to run tests in two other areas. Underfunding is a serious issue. There are other concerns that I hope our panelists will touch on today that present challenges to this census and future ones in addition to the underfunding. There are public concerns about information security and privacy, as we learned last week, declining response rates, an information explosion and rapidly changing technologies, different language requirements with a diverse population, complex living arrangements, and finally, a mobile population. This is the first census that will have an online option. Finally, there is in this census the inclusion of a question on citizenship status and what that could do to response rates. I hope that our panelists can touch on some of these issues today. Let me just say a word about each one of them. They'll each speak for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll have an open conversation. John Thompson, who will speak first, is Executive Director of the Council of Professional Associations on Federal Statistics, and more important for this panel, the 24th Director of the Census, where he served from August 2013 to June 2017. He introduced the Director's blog, which I read whenever it appeared. He was formerly president of NORC at the University of Chicago. Diane Schausenbach is director of the Institute for Policy Research and a faculty fellow at Northwestern and the Margaret Walker Alexander Professor in the School of Education and Social Policy there. She is also a research associate at MBER, and she was director of the Hamilton Project at Brookings. That is an initiative to promote policy to enhance broad-based economic growth. Hans von Spakovsky is manager of the Heritage Foundation's Election Law Reform Initiative and a senior legal fellow at the Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. He writes about civil rights, election integrity, immigration, and government regulation. He served for 2 years at the Federal Election Commission, and before that, he worked at the Justice Department. Michael Strain, my colleague here at AEI, is Director of Economic Policy Studies here and the John G. Searle Scholar at AEI. Mike oversees a broad portfolio. All of the institute's work in economic policy, financial markets, poverty studies, tech policy, energy economics, and healthcare policy. Mike worked at the Census Bureau. We'll begin today with John Thompson. Thank you.
Should I speak to here?
Yes.
Oh, good. So thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Michael had asked me to go about 5 minutes and sort of put the census in context, describe the readiness, so I'll attempt to do that. So I think everyone knows that the census is constitutionally mandated, Article 1, Section 2. It has a number of important uses, including reapportionment of the Congress, drawing of districts, both congressional districts and local voting districts. It's used to allocate over $600 billion a year of federal funds annually. It is essential for state, local, and tribal governments to make many decisions. It supports business investments in local communities. And finally, it's used to ensure the accuracy of virtually every demographic survey collected in the United States, which would include the current population survey, which produces the month-to-month change in unemployment, the National Health Interview Survey, which measures the health of our country, and the American Community Survey. That's why there's so many concerns about the accuracy of the census because of all the important uses. So to talk about the 2020 census readiness, I think it's important to understand that the census process has evolved in some ways, and in others it hasn't. So beginning in 1970, the Census Bureau went to a mail-back census, and that process has essentially been used until today, and that is you prepare an address list, questionnaires are mailed back, you electronically capture the information off the paper questionnaires, and then you go out and collect the information from those households that do not self-respond. And until today, that operation has been paper and pencil. And so as our country has grown more diverse over the years since 1970, the only way that a paper and pencil operation can be employed is you have to add more and more people to it. And that's why, if you look at the costs of the census over the years, they go up faster than any rate of inflation and faster than population growth. And again, it's because of using a paper and pencil operation to try to do something that's very difficult. So for the 2020 census, the idea was to modernize and use automation intelligently. And that went from developing the address list using modern geospatial technology so you don't have to walk every street in the country, to use the internet as the primary response option. And the Census Bureau, trust me, realizes that there are households that don't have access to the internet, and they provide those households a paper questionnaire. And they also allow people to call in for the first time and give their information over the phone. Importantly, though, the Census Bureau is using automation now, mobile technology, to deploy the workforce to collect the information from those households that don't self-respond. And they're going to be using iPhones and iPads to do this. It introduces tremendous efficiencies into the operation. In fact, the Census Bureau had estimated in 2014 that if they received the resources they needed, they could have reduced the cost of collecting the 2020 census from about $17 billion, which would be the cost of repeating the 2010 process in 2020, to a little over $12 billion. And that would have been about a $5 billion savings. However, if you look at the amount of money that the Census Bureau asked for and the amount they received, you'll see that from 2012 through 2017, the Census Bureau was underfunded by $200 million. And this forced the Census Bureau to make a number of decisions. They had to defer some operations. You just heard that they had to reduce 3 tests for their end-to-end test sites to 1, which was a function of this. They also had to defer, and this was very important, we can talk about this later, but they had to defer activities on their combined advertising and partnership program, which is essentially how they achieve accuracy in the census. I think the good news is that the Census Bureau in their FY18 budget did receive more money than they'd asked for, in fact, over $1 billion more. This really indicates bipartisan support, I believe, for the Census Bureau, and it will help them tremendously to overcome the difficulties that might be imposed on them this fall when there will undoubtedly be a continuing resolution. So it was a very, very good move. The Census Bureau still needs a lot more money, though. So finally, let me conclude by noting that recently the Census Commerce Secretary Ross decided to add a citizenship question to the census. I and 5 other directors of the Census Bureau have written a letter, which is publicly available, expressing our concerns about that. The essence is that we don't believe that, and I'll speak for myself right now, I don't believe that there has been adequate testing of such a question in a contemporary census environment, and there is a great risk to including it on the census. And as I said, an undercount that will result in this census will be with the Census Bureau for 10 years. It'll be there until 2030, and in all those uses I mentioned will be underrepresented. So it's very important that we have an accurate census. With that, I will conclude.
John, let me just ask a question in response. Can you tell us a little bit about how the dress rehearsal is going?
Well, I was at the Census Bureau's project management review, and they mentioned at the time that their self-response rate was about 36%, and they said that was on track with what they're looking for. the next big step, and the Census Bureau said that their automation was ready to go. We need to see the automation and how it works in the end-to-end test to make sure that it does work. And the good news there is that the GAO will be there looking at it independently, and they'll be writing public reports, so everyone will know how well it went.
Thank you, John. Diane, your introductory remarks.
Thanks so much. And it's a pleasure to be back here. Michael and I wrote a paper along with some other co-authors about a year ago where we tried to lay out a framework for why it's so important to have well-functioning Census Bureau and other statistical agencies, that those are very important to the United States. And I know that Michael and I will each talk a little bit more about that. But in terms of the census, we know that a successful and accurate decennial census is crucial to the United States for a number of reasons. So, of course, this determines the number of seats that each state has in the House of Representatives. But it also affects the distribution of billions of dollars in federal funding every year to local communities for infrastructure, for vital services like hospitals, like schools. But of course, we're facing increasing challenges to collecting the census. Just the increasing cultural, linguistic, and economic diversity in the United States just makes it harder to go out and survey everyone, to enumerate everyone. Layered on top of that is increasing distrust of the government. And so, as we know, in the past, the census has had some cost overruns, and they came up with a very innovative plan to try to keep the accuracy high, but also reduce costs this time. They were and still are planning on implementing a range of new data collection methods in the 2020 census, including this new internet and telephone response options, as well as the traditional paper questionnaire. Hopefully it'll make a lot of things more streamlined down the road. So by making these smart investments in technology, in messaging, in advertisement, and so on, to accurately count a population that's increasingly hard to count makes a lot of sense. But of course, we need to make those investments today, not in 2 years from now. If we wait, until it's too late, we'll end up pouring a lot more money on the problem to make sure that we get up to the accuracy that we need. So it's the first time really modernizing the census, and we need these tests. As everyone has pointed out, and I think everyone probably will continue to point out, we've already scaled back some of these tests, and it's very important that those are conducted with fidelity, and that we can troubleshoot. And something that not a lot of people sort of understand is we're not just talking about undercounting period, and it's not just immigrants. Although, to be sure, I predict that adding a citizenship question will increase the costs of this because more people will not want to answer this. But we also need to worry about undercounting or miscounting of the elderly, right? When we're moving now to something that involves the internet, it's predictable who's going to be less likely to be able to participate in that. Also, the statisticians tell us that it's very difficult to count people who have multiple residences. And if we don't do that with great fidelity, we'll end up not just undercounting, but sort of miscounting people. And so that could have real consequences, not only for the number of people in the House of Representatives, the apportionment, but also on dollars spent. So just to conclude, we've heard a little bit about the need for smart investments today, and I agree that the Census Bureau has been underfunded. We're also concerned about leadership in the Census Bureau. It's long benefited from exceptional, bipartisan, highly qualified leadership, and we need to make sure that we fill this role with someone who's highly qualified and nonpartisan, who will be respected on both sides of the aisle as the new director. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Diane, you mentioned the online or the internet option. Do you see that as enhancing participation, or are you worried that it...
Certainly in the long run, it should. And
yeah.
It is well timed that we modernize the census and that we use this approach. But it's just going to require a lot of testing and a lot of understanding who can we reach better with this and who do we have to do more following up with.
And the privacy concerns?
I think we'll get into that, yeah,
okay,
for sure.
Good. Hans.
Well, I want to thank AEI for inviting me to be here today. Michael actually asked me to talk about probably what's raised the greatest controversy over the census recently, and that is the announcement at the end of March to add a citizenship question to the census. Now, I think a lot of the criticism against the administration for doing that is unfair and unwarranted. In fact, I think those criticisms are wrong, and I want to give you a quote from the president. And I think the president's correct when he says this. The quote is, "For the purpose also of more exactly distinguishing the increase of population by birth and immigration, we should know, quote, the respective numbers of native citizens, citizens of foreign birth, and of aliens." Now, all of you think that I was just quoting President Donald Trump. You're incorrect. I was just quoting President Thomas Jefferson, who said that in 1800, and in 1820, the census followed that recommendation and added a citizenship question to the census on, quote, foreigners not naturalized. Now, I give you that fact of history because if you've listened to some of the hysterical claims by opponents or read the coverage in the paper, you would probably not realize that what the Trump administration is doing is not adding a citizenship question, but reinstating a citizenship question on the census. That question was consistently asked on different censuses until 1950, when the U.S. Census Bureau switched to sending out a short form and a long form. Those of you who are older in the audience will remember probably that about 1 in 6 households used to get the long form as opposed to the short form. The long form had a citizenship question on it, as demonstrated by the long form from the 2000 census, which is not that long ago. Now, after the 2000 census, the long form was discontinued, and the Census Bureau switched to what's called the American Community Survey. This is sent out continuously, but it only goes to 1 out of 38 households. And it only provides basically estimates of demographic characteristics, which makes its use nationwide problematical. The ACS, which has been used since then and is used today, has always had a citizenship question on it. And if you want to download the 2018 form, you will find the citizenship question on the ACS, and what the Commerce Department has said they're going to do is add the very same citizenship question back onto the census. And keep this in mind. It does not ask you whether you are here legally or not. It simply asks, are you a citizen of the United States? And it's important for everyone to understand that there's a federal law that bars the Census Bureau from sharing individualized information from the census with any other government agency or publicizing it, and that, in fact, is a criminal violation of the law if they do that. So the fear that somehow this information is going to get sent to DHS, for example, is just not true. By the way, when I hear people talk about how this is going to make the response rate go down, there's no evidence that it's going to make the response rate go down. There's no evidence that it's caused the response rate to go down to the ACS. In fact, the ACS, if you look at it, it has a lot more intrusive questions on it. I can give you some samples if we want to later that would upset people a lot more than a citizenship question. By the way, if you look at the memo that was put out by the Commerce Department, you'll see that they talked to a former deputy director of the census who's now at the Nielsen polling firm, who told Commerce that when they add a citizenship question to their surveys, they've seen, quote, no appreciable decrease in response rates. And another quote from there that I think is correct is this. This is from Kevin Dunn Kelly of the Commerce Department. Even if there is some impact on responses, the value of more complete and accurate data derived from surveying the entire population outweighs such concerns. Because remember, ACS only goes to 1 out of 38 households. Census data, as you've heard, is used for everything from enforcing the Voting Rights Act, where citizenship data is essential, to the distribution of federal funding. Look, we've been in a contentious debate over immigration policy in this country now for 10 years. Does anyone doubt that we should have accurate data on the citizenship population if we want to have an informed debate about it and come up with a remedy? And finally, what I know will surely make the opponents of the administration in adding this question grind their teeth is that the Trump administration is actually following recommendations made by the United Nations. If you look at their principles and recommendations for population and housing censuses 2017, you'll find that they recommend a citizenship question on their census surveys, and that countries ranging from Australia to Germany to Indonesia all ask this question on their censuses. Only in the U.S. is this considered at all controversial, and it shouldn't be. Thanks.
Thank you, Hans. I expect you'll get some disagreement from our next panelist, Michael Strain.
Typically, one of the problems of speaking last is that there's not much left to say, but that's a nice segue to provide a contrasting view on the citizenship question. I am concerned about the impact the citizenship question will have on response rates. It is, of course, the case that we currently ask about citizenship on the American Community Survey. It's also the case that the American Community Survey is a much less salient exercise in data collection than the decennial census. The Census Bureau has found evidence that people in immigrant and minority communities today are concerned about the 2020 census in a way that they are not concerned about the American Community Survey. And the reasons for that are easy enough to figure out, I think. First, the decennial census is a major undertaking. You knock on every door, you count every person. The government takes out a lot of money to advertise the exercise in order to get people to comply with the survey. It's in the Constitution. It's something that people notice. People pay much less attention to the American Community Survey, and they should pay less attention to the American Community Survey. So it's hard to kind of map what happens with the American Community Survey onto what happens with the decennial census and to expect that the people will respond in the same way. It's also true that in conducting tests for the 2020 census, the Census Bureau has found that members of immigrant and minority communities are concerned about answering the census at all. This concern was registered before there was a decision made about the citizenship question. So even apart from whether or not the 2020 decennial has a citizenship question, the Census Bureau has found that members of immigrant and minority communities are concerned about answering the 2020 census at all. And the reasons for that are not terribly hard to understand either. There's been a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric coming from Washington. There's been a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric coming from the President of the United States, both after he took office and when he was a presidential candidate. There has been a contentious debate about immigration for sure, and the status of the Dreamers and all sorts of things have kind of led to this moment where people in some immigrant and minority communities are concerned about answering questions in general. And it's quite reasonable, based on the evidence we have, to conclude that they will be even more reticent to answer a government form that asks about their citizenship status. Now, why should we care about that? An important reason we should care about that is that if people are less likely to answer the question, the cost of the decennial census goes way up. The census is in the Constitution. The Bureau does not have a choice about whether or not it attempts to enumerate the population. And that means that if you don't answer the online form, if you don't fill out your form, the Census Bureau does not just say, okay, we tried our best. Instead, they send someone to your house. And they knock on the door. They say, I'm here from the government. I have a few questions for you. That doesn't go over well all the time. People slam the door. The Bureau doesn't say, okay, well, we tried our best. They send somebody back. And if you want to answer the questions, they ask your neighbor to say, hey, how many people live in this house? Sending human beings costs money. And if we want to keep the costs of the decennial census under control, which I think we all should, then we should not be putting questions on the decennial census that will make it more necessary to send more people to gather this information in person. It also affects the accuracy of the census, and that has ripple effects for the next 10 years. The 2020 census will be used to benchmark the current population survey, the American Community Survey, other demographic and economic surveys for years and years and years. And any small errors in that benchmarking will be with us for a decade, and those small errors compound over time. Very important decisions are made using those data sources. Decisions about interest rates. If the Federal Reserve looks at the current population survey and the current population survey mismeasures unemployment a little bit and the Fed tightens a little too fast, or the Fed lets the economy run hot a little too long, billions and billions and billions of dollars are at stake. If Social Security, which adjusts its payments based on inflation, if those inflation measures are off just a little bit, billions and billions of dollars are at stake. Private sector businesses rely on data that are benchmarked against the decennial census to decide where to open distribution centers, to decide what items to put on store shelves, to make all sorts of critical decisions. If the data they're relying on are just a little bit inaccurate, then those costs to that business compound over time. So small errors have big effects when you consider how important the decennial census is and when you consider how long we have to live with it. Again, another reason not to introduce inaccuracy by including a citizenship question. Those are the costs of potentially including this question. What's the benefit? I don't see much of one at all. We have accurate, valid information on citizenship that comes from other less visible data sources. We have been able to rely on that for decades and decades. So to me, there's no clear reason to do this. And when you have a proposition where there's very little, if any, benefit and significant costs, that says that we shouldn't do that particular thing. So my hope is that Congress intervenes and keeps that question off the decennial, and I think it would be better for business and better for policymakers and ultimately better for taxpayers if that ends up being the case.
Thank you, Mike. And John and Diane, I want you to jump in, but first a few questions for Hans. How do you respond to Mike's points about the salience of the ACS versus the census, the cost, the accuracy, and the benefit?
Well, the problem with the ACS is that it only goes to 1 to 38 households. Therefore, they do estimating and extrapolating to try to figure out how it applies to the rest of the country. That causes problems in, for example, enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. And I know about that because I worked at the Justice Department for 4 years enforcing the Voting Rights Act. And the reason that's important is this. If you are enforcing Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which prevents and prohibits racial discrimination in voting, and you are, for example, filing a lawsuit against a state or a county or a city, claiming that they have diluted the vote by the way they have packed particular districts, and you are suing on behalf of, say, Hispanic voters. Well, if you're coming up with a remedy, your remedy is to come up with a district in which minority voters can elect their candidate of choice. Now, the way you do that is you have to ensure, for example, if you're suing on behalf of Hispanic voters, that when you create a district for them, that they have at least 50% plus one of the population in that district so they can elect their candidates of choice. Well, if you just use population and you only have a citizenship rate of, say, 60%, putting in a 60% Hispanic population is not going to give you a majority of Hispanic voters. So it's essential to have citizenship data. And the ACS, because it goes to such a limited number of households, does not give you good enough data to do that. And you don't have to believe me about that. You can look at a U.S. Supreme Court decision from a couple of years ago where this was an issue, and the Supreme Court talked about the lack of data in this area on this. A census question will get us that for the whole country, and I would repeat what the Commerce Department said, which is there is no empirical evidence that this is going to cause any kind of significant downturn in the response rate. And if it did, we would know about it from the ACS, which the Census Bureau does all the time, and they've produced no such data.
Diane, John, would you like to join this conversation, this point of conversation?
I would like to make a couple points. One, the theory behind the ACS, and I think we've realized it, is that it was replacing the long form because it was going to produce more accurate data than the long form. So the ACS has two products. It has one product that comes out every year, and it has another product that comes out on an average over 5 years. I'm misusing the term average probably, but you can think of it as a 5-year average, and that produces data for very small areas, census tracts, census block groups, that have the same level of accuracy as the census long form. So the American Community Survey produces the data that is the same quality for citizenship that we have observed since 1950. And we've been able to do that. So I think I will stop there.
Diane?
Yeah, I think my primary concern is about the accuracy of the census overall, and that it sounds like Hans disagrees about whether this will drive up costs, but I think there's this adds significant risk. I'm pretty persuaded by Michael's arguments that this will probably either reduce the accuracy of the census or drive up the costs, and I think the benefit of what we get over and above the American Community Survey is quite small.
Good. Mike?
Well, I don't think I have much more to add. I mean, I do think it's again, just to repeat myself, I think it's very difficult to compare what happens with the American Community Survey to the decennial census. Most people don't have any idea that the American Community Survey is happening. Everybody understands that the decennial census is happening. The U.S. Census Bureau does not spend millions of dollars to help with compliance on the American Community Survey in the same way that they do with the decennial census. The Census Bureau has found that local community leaders in immigrant and minority communities, like church pastors or other similar types of community leaders, in some cases are telling people in their communities not to answer the decennial census because of some of the anti-immigrant rhetoric that's been coming from the administration and coming from the president and coming from Washington generally. That does not happen with the American Community Survey. The American Community Survey gives us the information that we need to do things like enforce the Voting Rights Act. The American Community Survey's question on citizenship is as accurate as the previous question that was asked once every 10 years on citizenship before the American Community Survey was adopted. So we're not losing anything by way of accuracy. The short, simple, 10 or so question decennial census has not included a question on citizenship in decades, and we've been fine enforcing the voting right. Well, maybe not fine, but we have not needed to add a citizenship question to the short form in order to enforce the Voting Rights Act over that time as well.
Well, I think we have some pretty profound disagreement on that, and I think we'll probably have some questions from you in the audience a little later about the citizenship question. But I'd like to turn to John now to ask just about how some of the kinds of questions that the census has been asking over time have evolved in terms of the complexities we have in this society today, the multiple languages, the complex living arrangements, the mobile population. How are you coping? How was the census coping with that when you were there, and how are we coping today?
So I think that you're hitting on something that every statistical agency and every company that produces data is facing. That is, our population is becoming much more diverse, much more complex to measure. And so you've seen an emergence of a variety of techniques to reach out in new ways to individuals. You've also seen questions that have evolved more to measure the population. So, for example, the Census Relationship Question now asks questions on same-sex marriage or same-sex partners where it didn't before. So you see sort of an evolution of the questions that we ask that parallels our society.
Mm-hmm. Diane, do you have some thoughts about this, or?
Mostly harping back on, and that makes everything more expensive,
Yeah.
right? Because we have to think about how to measure this, we have to test how to measure it, et cetera, et cetera. And so then in order to stay accurate, we need to make these wise investments, especially up front.
Yeah. John, can you tell us a little bit about how it actually happens? I mean, it seems to me it's like mounting an army to do a U.S. Census every 10 years. How many people are involved?
So, I think at peak right now, the Census Bureau is looking at hiring somewhere between 300 and 500,000 temporary workers in 2020 to collect the information from those that don't self-respond, and they'll have set up about 250 temporary offices to manage those people from. So it's a bit, and they have to set up the information technology and the infrastructure to manage that kind of operation.
And how many languages?
So I'm not. When I left, they were looking at having the questionnaire in 5 languages, and they'll provide assistance in up to probably 100 languages that they need. So they're very attuned to the languages of our population.
Yeah, that's impressive. We certainly heard a lot last week when Mr. Zuckerberg testified about information security. How concerned should Americans be about the privacy and information security of the census?
So
You're the point man here, John.
yeah,
I
no.
know
I know the Census Bureau. When I was there, and still there, and they still are, that information security is their top priority in terms of building systems. So, and they work with experts in the field. They work with the Department of Homeland Security. They work with the National Institutes of Science and Technology. They work with private sector companies. And before any system is implemented, it has to undergo some very serious testing, including penetration testing by an outside person. That being said, in the world of cybersecurity, you can never stop being worried. You always have to be working very, very hard at that. So I felt comfortable when I was there that the Census Bureau was addressing the cyber challenges, but it's something you can't stop doing.
Other comments on this point?
Well,
or?
the one thing I would point out is that throughout our history, the Census Bureau has actually been very good in keeping the information confidential, with one very big exception. The very big exception that I'm sure people know about is the fact that Franklin Roosevelt, in essence, ignored the law, and they used census data during World War II to locate Japanese Americans and to go after them. That was a violation of the law. It should not have happened, but it did. But that's really the only real significant example of census breaking the federal rules about confidentiality of census data.
Yeah. In my world of survey research, we worry a lot about declining response rates, and the wonderful work done by the Pew Research Center shows that, for example, about 20 years ago, we had a 36% average response rate for public opinion surveys. That's now down to about 9%. It's held pretty steady over the last few years in Pew's data overall. But I wonder if one of you could give us some clues about how the response rates have changed over time to the census. And here, John, again, you may be the person we turn to first.
So the self-response rates have dropped off. If you go back to 1970, the self-response rates were in the high 70s. In the more modern times, 1990, 2000, 2010, the response rates were more in the 60 to 65 percentile range.
We'd love that in the survey world.
Yeah, well, but if you look at some surveys like the Current Population Survey, which is one of the highest voluntary response rate surveys that the federal government conducts, you can see a steady drop-off in response since 2010, and it's been a real problem for the Census Bureau. And they're working very hard to address it, but it's just getting harder and harder to convince people to respond.
And have you taken surveys about why people aren't responding? And Diane, you can weigh in here too.
Do you want to answer that one first?
No,
And
go
then-
ahead.
Well, so I wanted to make sure that everyone understands that when we do public opinion surveys or the current population survey, et cetera, you have to have a benchmark to compare the response and non-response in those two. And that benchmark is the United States Census, which is all the more reason why it's just critically important that we get an accurate census in the year 2020. So that this measuring stick that all of these other surveys are measured against and sort of adjusted for when there's non-response, when there's sampling and non-sampling error, et cetera. It has to be accurate. So all the more reason that we want to make sure that we get this conducted to the level that we need it to be.
I might mention, because this often surprises members of the public. It actually surprised me when I took a look at it. But I often actually get calls from people who are upset about the American Community Survey. And they're not upset about the citizenship question. They are very upset about the very detailed income questions, because most people don't like the idea of having to tell the government what their income is. What you all should know is that there's actually a federal statute that makes it a crime for you to refuse to answer a census. You can be fined up to $500. Some people might think that's worth it to not have to answer some of the questions, but you can be fined $500. And there's actually some reported cases. Most of them are very old, where people were prosecuted by the Justice Department for refusing to answer the census. So that is always an option the government has. They just haven't exercised that option very often.
Yeah. We have, I think, about 15 minutes left today, and I think it's time to turn to your questions. And please identify yourself and ask a question. We can start over here, and please wait for a microphone.
Hi, Andrew Reamer, George Washington University. A question for John and a question for Hans. John, my understanding is that the Secretary's announcement of what's on the questionnaire is really his proposal, and that there's a process now of census submitting to the Office of Management and Budget the actual census form, and OMB, through the Paperwork Reduction Act, has to approve the 2020 census as it approves every federal survey. And I think we should see that announcement in a couple weeks, and that the public then has 60 days to tell Census what it thinks of this design. And then Census submits it to OMB, and then public gets another 30 days later in the year. So if you could just describe this process to people, and OMB's power to decide what goes on the survey form. So that's for you, for Hans. Actually, I think you said two things that are incorrect. One is that what the census did in 1940 actually was legal. There was a law that was passed that allowed them to do it. It may have been morally wrong, but it was actually legal. The second thing is that the fine for not answering the census, while the organic census law says $500 for lying or $100 for not filling something out, it's actually up to $5,000, because in the 80s, Congress passed crime control legislation that essentially overrode statutes that were specific to individual agencies. So if you go to the census website, it says people can be fined up to $5,000. The third thing, Hans, sorry, and I'll be done, okay, is that there is actually, Census brought evidence to its National Advisory Committee regarding recent, as in the past year, fears of respondents to answering the citizenship question. So there was a presentation with descriptions in great detail. This was kind of raised to the level of alarm among census staff. That people were lying, people were walking out of the room, people were visibly sweating. And this was not mentioned by the Secretary. So the census internally has seen evidence, compared to 3 years ago, of a change in people's attitudes regarding the citizenship question. It was not addressed by the Secretary. Could you respond to all that, please?
Hans, John?
So I'll go first. Andrew, you were just about right on with the process. I mean, the Paperwork Reduction Act requires every information collection to be approved by the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs at the Office of Management and Budget. And so the Census Bureau will put out the questionnaire for public comment. That's the questionnaire they'll use in 2020. And they'll have 60 days. Then I believe sometime around September, October, that whole package, including the comments, will go to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, and they can approve or disapprove any of the questions on there. They'll have documentation as to why the questions are important in the research. So that is the next step in the process.
Hans?
On the process question, I will answer that by mentioning the fact that, as I'm sure you know, more than a dozen states have sued the government over the addition of the citizenship question. I think those suits will all fail, and the reason is that if you look at the Constitution, the power to conduct the census is given to the federal government, not the states, and the federal government has delegated, there's a specific statute that gives the Commerce Secretary the power to, quote, determine the inquiries on the census form. So the states really don't have any say in this, and I think their claims are without merit. You're talking again about anecdotal evidence. There's no empirical data that shows a reduction in response rates. The Nielsen firm, which talked to the Commerce Department, said that in their surveys they've seen no reduction in response rates. And again, I've said this more than once, but I'll repeat it. The Census Bureau sends out the ACS all the time with a citizenship question on it, and if it had any empirical evidence that the citizenship question reduced the response rate on the ACS, they would have produced that, and they didn't.
Yeah. Question from this side of the room at all, or right here? Yeah, and please wait for the mic. Right here. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Archibald Hamilton. I just wanted to ask a question, trying to find if the census, knowing what's happened with the elections, meddling, and what happened with Facebook, have you go ahead and open a window that will try to prevent what could be happening in this in the Census Bureau? Mm-hmm. Could it be some kind of foreign of external meddling in the census, mm-hmm. knowing what is happening now?
John, is the census or Diane prepared for this possibility?
So I think part of the issue for the Census Bureau is that any time there's any kind of breach of public confidence, it sort of falls on all of the different agencies that are collecting data, including the Census Bureau. So the Census Bureau is going to have a harder job in communicating, which they will, that the data they have is confidential and that they have processes in place to protect the integrity of the data. But every time something like that happens, it makes it harder and harder for them to get that message out.
Diane, you?
Yeah, I think a similar answer, which is that we need to make these investments in technology to make the whole thing more productive, but alongside that, we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to secure the data, especially anything that's done online. The Census Bureau has a terrific track record historically in terms of this. They take confidentiality extremely seriously. They take data security extremely seriously. And so, we would need to get somebody who's an expert in those specific things, to testify to that. But I have utmost confidence in the Bureau.
Okay. There's a question over here, and then over here. We'll go to that one in the corner first, and then to you.
Thanks.
And please identify yourselves.
Right. I'm Peggy Chow. I'm the congressional correspondent for the Hispanic Outlook. So I've had two questions about just some. It seems really loosey-goosey stuff that comes out of the census. Number one is the number of Latino in the community, Hispanics, which of course are not a race recognized by the Census Bureau. So how do they come to this? Is it, I understand it's just by last names, but you get someone like Congressman Tancredo who said he gets stuff all the time from being a Hispanic. So how do they determine the Hispanic community, not less the Latino vote? And then along with that is, for a long time they said they could not estimate the numbers of illegal immigrants in the country, but suddenly we get this, it seems like, number in concrete, 11 million. That hasn't changed, by the way, despite so-called record numbers of deportations. So how do they arrive at that?
John?
So I can address the Hispanic question. So right now, the census asks two questions related to that. The first question asks about Hispanic origin, and the second, and it has different categories to check. And the second question asks about race. Part of the issue that the Census Bureau had been addressing over the decade was understanding some of the issues associated with an other race category and those who were Hispanic and would sometimes mark that category. They had done some significant research on combining the two questions together, and they concluded that that was the optimal way to ask race and ethnicity. However, they have not been able to implement that combined question technology because the Office of Management and Budget hasn't changed the 1997 standards on race and ethnicity that requires two questions.
But to underscore it, it's self-reported by
It's
individuals.
self-reported,
There's nobody's
yes.
looking at last
Right.
names.
Oh,
something
no,
like that.
no,
They're
no.
asking people, how do you identify?
Yes.
And then,
include Spanish, it includes people from not Spain.
It's how anybody chooses to answer the question.
It's self-response.
It's self-responded. It's how individuals choose to answer the question.
Okay, what about the Latino vote?
number of immigrants. Or,
The Census Bureau, when I was there, wasn't estimating the illegal population, so I'd have to defer to some of my colleagues and maybe at Pew or something.
That number comes from the Department of Homeland Security, and I'm not quite sure how they come up with that number, so I don't know the answer to that.
It's from the
Oh,
ACE.
thanks.
Yeah. Question here in the middle,
microphone.
and please identify yourself.
Karen Gagliano. My question is, I think I heard you say that there's going to be an electronic distribution of the census. Is that correct?
Online.
Online.
Well,
Proportion.
the Census Bureau will send out an invitation by mail to respond over the internet. They're not going to send emails to people saying respond. So just
Thank you
to be
for that
clear.
clarification. What intrigues me is that there's so much focus on this legal, illegal question versus the fact that not everyone is electronically literate, and that cuts across a lot of populations, aging, poor, people who don't have access to computers, et cetera. And I would think that that, in this day and age, would have an even bigger impact on response rate and the skewing of responses.
So let me just say a little something about that. So the Census Bureau will mail out, they have two ways that they invite people to respond. One is called Internet First, where you get a letter or a postcard that says, please respond by the internet. And at some point in the process, if people don't respond, they will get a paper questionnaire. But it's Internet First, and the last mailing would be a paper questionnaire. The second method is called Internet Choice, where they identify areas in the country using the American Community Survey and some other data where they believe that most people would rather respond by paper. And for those areas, they mail out a questionnaire. That'll be about 20% of the households in the United States will get a questionnaire in the mail, and then they'll have the choice. They can either respond by the internet or they can fill out the paper questionnaire. And also, if they want to call in, they can call in and give their interview over the telephone. This is a first for the 2020 census.
No, I get all that, but
Yeah.
from a research standpoint, everyone in this room is probably electronically savvy, and I would be concerned that the response rate among certain populations will be higher because we'll just go to our computers and respond, and other people, I understand they have these other options, but this is quick.
Absolutely. So that's, I think, one reason why the end-to-end test is very important, so that we can understand before we field the full 2020 census, who's going to respond, who's not going to respond, and what cases do we need to send those 300 to 500,000 enumerators, to the home to help, people respond, and so on. But in order to make this step forward, which I think is needed for financial reasons, and to modernize the census, we need to be able to test and understand sort of the strengths and weaknesses of the new approach. That's why we need an end-to-end test. But we've only got one where we should have had three.
There's a question in the back here, and then we'll go up here. Yes.
Hello, my question is for Hans. In your opinion, what are the effects of having the citizenship question? What I'm thinking is about, let's say, California. They implement policies to attract a big population of illegal immigrants versus Alabama. Let's say, if you count all that illegal migrant population in California, that will give California more seats in Congress and more votes in the Electoral College. What is your opinion about this situation? Because that will, other state will lose representation with a higher citizen population.
Well, that happens anyway. Apportionment is based on total population. Now, and again, I want to remind everyone that it simply asks, are you a citizen? It does not ask whether you're here legally or illegally. Because the census counts total population, because apportionment is done based on that total population, what it means is that states with large numbers of aliens who are here illegally actually do get more congressional seats. There's been a number of studies done about this. One of the last ones that I saw had an estimate that California, for example, has between 5 and 6 extra congressional seats because of their large illegal alien population. I think Texas is estimated to have 2. And there are some states that if the apportionment was based only on citizenship population, they would get additional seats, which they are not getting right now. That's not going to change because you have a citizenship question on here. That would only change if the law, and you might have to have a constitutional amendment governing apportionment, was changed.
Yeah. We have time for two.
Can I just,
go ahead.
1 second. It's important to be clear about that last point. The Constitution is clear that that the apportionment of seats in the House to the several states is not determined by citizenship. It's determined by the number of people who are living there. And so including the citizenship question won't affect, well, depending on how it affects accuracy and response rates, et cetera, but knowing with more precision the number of citizens in each state doesn't affect how many House seats each state gets, which, in my view, is another reason not to include it.
There's a question up here, and then we'll have one final question in the back, right here in the front.
Hi there. I struggle a little bit with a little bit of a chicken and egg problem when it comes to the citizenship question and responses. Of course, there's a level of fear in the immigrant community right now, just generally of the government. And we know from a while now that immigrants are one of the undercounted populations in every census, and that there's the census automatically looks at that and says, okay, we have an undercount, and we figure out how much it is every year. But it seems to me that the more we talk about the concern about this, the more people might get scared. And so you have this sort of chicken and egg, where as everybody talks about how scared people are to respond, people will be more scared to respond. In past years, there have been efforts by immigrant advocacy organizations to encourage responses to the census, recognizing that the law says that it cannot be used, trying to advertise that. And so one of the questions I have for Mr. Thompson and others is, how does the census, or does the census work with other organizations, nonprofits, to try to organically support response to the census, try to alleviate some of those fears? And how can we sort of balance, if this is going to happen, whether it does or doesn't, but if it's going to happen, I think there's still valid reason to have everybody counted. For every reason that you have said, how can we encourage more responses in this age of fear?
Sure. So since the 2000 census, the Census Bureau has started a program of paid advertising combined with partnership, where they hire individuals to go work in local communities with local governments, with local places, local leaders, and get local voices to talk about the importance of the census and the confidentiality of the census. I believe in the last census, they had approximately 250,000 partners nationally at peak to help them get the word out about the importance of the census. So they're going to do their best in 2020 to form as many partnerships as they can. The issue with the citizenship question is that it may make it harder for them to get that word out about the confidentiality of the census.
One question in the back. You have the final question, sir.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Todd Wiggins. I wanted to ask you if we could end with a happy note, because I don't really believe that most of what is collected in the census is accurate, because it's based on voluntary response. And so you have to skew that. It's kind of like advertising. So where is the census most accurately and ideally collected? What country in the planet does the best job of getting accurate information and has the best incentives for people to answer accurately? And how does it work? And can we repeat that here?
So I don't even know. I don't know if that. I don't know if there is an answer. It may not be knowable. My first thought after hearing your question, which is a good one, I think, is just to point out how simple and sparse the decennial census is. I mean, it's very basic questions. How many people live in this household? How old are they? What are their races? What's their ethnicity? Which again, is an argument against, I think, putting controversial questions on there. That is likely collected, quite accurately. But some of the hard-to-reach groups who live in rural areas, members of immigrant and minority communities, the elderly, people who live in what census calls group quarters, like college dorms, that sort of stuff. There it starts to get difficult. And I think that difficulty highlights the need for the Census Bureau to be adequately funded in the run-up to the 2020 census, because that money needs to be spent today in order to make sure that when it comes time to send out the questionnaires and when it comes time to send out the enumerators to knock on the doors, that people know how to get to those hard to reach communities and how to get to those people who are less likely to answer and get an accurate response from them.
Yeah. Well, we've covered an enormous amount of ground in a very short period of time. I'm sure our panelists will be happy to stay for a few more minutes to answer any other questions you have, but I think we all want this great civic engagement project to be an enormous success, and I think that's what all of our panelists are committed to. I'm reminded of the fact that both Thomas Jefferson, whom you mentioned, and George Washington thought there was an undercount. So to be continued. These debates go on. Thank you so much for coming, and thank our panelists.